The Apache woman was caught in a trap, and then she heard the hunter's footsteps coming closer through the wild. Before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor and hit that like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The valley was dead quiet. The only sound was the wind ripping through the pines, snapping old branches like bones. It carried the smell of iron-cold water from the creek, a smell that meant winter wasn't letting go. The ground crunched under Asher's boots, a thin layer of snow over frozen dirt. He walked this same trail almost every day, a ghost in his own life. Trap pole on his shoulder, eyes scanning the lines he'd set in the dark hours of the morning. It was a routine, a ritual. Check the traps, bring back what he caught, mend what was broken, make sure nothing, absolutely nothing, went to waste. Asher Hale was 32, but he carried himself like a man twice that age, worn down by things he never spoke about. His hair was cut short, his face covered in rough stubble, and his coat was a patchwork of repairs. A long, ugly scar ran down his right thigh, a souvenir from a war he tried to forget every single day. It gave him a limp, a constant reminder that forced him to plant his left leg strong and let the right one drag just behind. He'd lived alone in this cabin for 3 years. Ever since the fever took his younger brother, the last piece of family he had left in the world. Out here, his mission was brutally simple. Stay alive, keep the traps working, keep the stove burning. But that afternoon, something changed. As he rounded the bend where the creek cut a narrow path between 2 jagged ridges, he heard it. A cry. Sharp. Human. His entire body went rigid. His hand clenched the trap pole so hard the wood groaned against his palm. He stood perfectly still, listening, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted out. The second cry was thinner, strained, but there was no mistaking it. It was a woman, and she was in serious trouble. He pushed through the brush, moving faster than he had in years, the pull in his leg screaming in protest. Snow sprayed up from his boots. Branches clawed at his coat. When he finally broke through into the small clearing, he saw her. She was half on her side, one leg caught tight in a steel trap. The kind meant for wolves, the kind with teeth. The iron jaws had bitten deep into her flesh. Blood soaked through the torn deerskin at her shin, a dark red stain melting the snow beneath her. Her hands were pale and shaking as she clawed at the trap, trying to pry the jaws open, but she was too weak. All her strength was gone. Her long black hair was a tangled mess across her face, stuck to her cheeks with sweat and grime despite the biting cold. The neckline of her dress was torn wide open, showing the dark, ugly bruises on her collarbone and the hollow line of her chest. She looked like a cornered animal, her jaw tight with rage, but her body was broken, betrayed by pain and hunger. Asher's stomach twisted. He'd seen animals in traps. He'd seen men die in the war. But he'd never seen a person caught in cold steel like this. For a single frozen heartbeat, he weighed his options. She was Apache. Out here, in this territory, that alone would make most men turn around and walk away without a second thought. But Asher wasn't most men anymore. The war had burned that part out of him. He'd seen enough bodies left to rot in muddy fields. He'd seen enough dying left unfinished. He wouldn't be that man. Not again. He set his pole down, dropped to one knee in the snow, and put both his hands on the trap. The spring fought back, its steel screaming as the teeth bit deeper into her leg for a second, before finally, with a sickening pop, they let go. She gasped, her whole body jerking, and then she just sagged against the snow, limp as a rag doll. He tossed the trap aside and looked at the wound. It was deep, but it wasn't the kind that kills you. Not if it's cleaned right. Not if it's clean now. He didn't say a word. Words were useless out here. He just hooked one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees and lifted her from the snow. Her body was terrifyingly light. He could feel the sharp angles of her bones right through the thin dress. She made a small sound, half pain, half relief, and her head fell against his chest. He glanced one last time at the trap lying open in the bloody snow, its teeth glinting in the pale light. Then he turned and started the long walk back to his cabin. The walk back was a special kind of hell. His bad leg screamed with every single step up the icy slope, but he kept his grip tight and his pace even. He just kept telling himself one thing, over and over. She wouldn't survive the night out here alone. That was reason enough. That was all the reason he needed. Finally, the cabin came into view. A small, dark shape leaning into the hill, its roof crusted with snow. Smoke still drifted faintly from the chimney, a ghost of the fire he'd left burning that morning. He shifted her weight, shouldered the heavy door open, and stepped inside. The heat rolled over them, thick with the smell of pine wood smoke and solitude. He didn't hesitate. He carried her straight to the narrow bed in the corner. The quilt was faded and worn, but it was clean. He laid it there every morning out of habit, never expecting anyone would ever use it but him. He set her down as carefully as he could, trying not to jar her injured leg. She hissed through her teeth, but kept her eyes locked on him, sharp and defiant despite the weakness that was pulling her under. Asher just stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the sweat on his neck turning cold. He hadn't let another living soul into this cabin in 3 years. Not since his brother died. Not since he chose the silence of the mountains over the noise of people. But leaving her out there to die in the snow, it hadn't been an option. Not for him. Not anymore. He dropped his coat on a chair, rolled up his sleeves, and reached for the kettle on the stove. The water would need to boil. The wound would need stitching. He'd done worse in the war. He could do this now. He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and his voice was low and steady when he spoke. "You're safe here." For just a second, the hardness in her eyes softened. Then they fluttered closed, her body finally surrendering to the warmth and the safety she never thought she'd find. And Asher stood there, the silence of the cabin settling around him, already feeling the immense weight of the choice he had just made. A choice that he knew, deep in his bones, was about to change everything. But as he looked down at her, he noticed something strange. The bruises on her collarbone. They weren't fresh. They were old. And they weren't from a fall. They were shaped like fingerprints. Someone had grabbed her. Hard. The kettle on the stove began to hiss, the sound filling the small cabin as steam clouded the low rafters. Asher pulled a small tin box from a shelf above the stove. It was old, dented, but the contents were his most valuable possessions. Inside were the few things he'd kept from his time as a soldier. A surgeon's needle, a spool of thick thread, rags torn from an old uniform shirt, a stub of carbolic soap, and a half-full flask of cheap whiskey. He'd always told himself these things were for him, in case the old war wound in his leg ever tore open again. Now, they were for her. She lay on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes fluttered open when he pulled a chair close and sat down with a basin of hot water. He expected to see fear in her eyes, but there was none. Only a deep, weary suspicion. The kind of watchfulness that comes from knowing that most men in this world cause more harm than good. Her lips parted, as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. She just turned her face back toward the ceiling, her jaw set like stone. Asher took his knife and carefully cut away the leather of her boot, his movements slow, deliberate, trying not to tug at the mangled flesh. The trap had bitten clean through skin and deep into the muscle. Infection was his biggest fear. Out here, a bad infection was a death sentence. His hands shook just once, and he clenched his jaw until they were steady again. He couldn't let her see his doubt. He'd stitched worse wounds in darker places. He poured hot water over the gash, flushing out the blood and the dirt. She gasped, her hand clamping down on the quilt, but she didn't scream. "You'll need stitches," he said, his voice flat, but not unkind. "It'll hurt, but it'll hold." Her eyes, dark and unblinking, shifted to him again. Then she gave a single, tiny nod. It was the smallest movement, but it was enough. He uncorked the flask and poured whiskey directly into the wound. She flinched hard, her teeth gritted, and her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a strength that shocked him. Her grip was like iron. He didn't pull away. He just held still, letting her hold on until the fire in her legs subsided and her fingers finally relaxed. Then, he threaded the needle and began to work. His stitches weren't neat, but they were tight and even, pulling the torn skin together with a soldier's grim precision. Sweat beaded on his forehead. By the time he tied the final knot and cut the thread with his knife, her face was pale and slick with a cold sweat, but she was still awake, and she was still watching him. When he was done, he wrapped the leg tight with a clean linen rag. He rinsed his hands in the basin, then leaned back in the chair, breathing a little harder than he wanted to admit. He found himself staring at her, not at the torn dress or the ugly bruises, but at the incredible way she had endured every second of the ordeal in absolute silence. "Name?" he asked, the word rough in his throat. Her voice was a low, raspy whisper. "Nah," he nodded once. "Asher Hale." He didn't offer any more than that. He rarely did. She let the name settle in the quiet room, then closed her eyes, the strain and the pain finally dragging her down into darkness. He pulled the quilt up higher, tucking it around her shoulders, then turned back to the stove. The cabin smelled of smoke and whiskey, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the stale air. He filled a tin cup with black coffee and set it on the small table beside her bed, just in case she woke up thirsty. But his mind was racing. He thought about all the questions any other man would have asked. Where did she come from? Why was she alone? Who had left her for dead in this valley? He left them all unspoken. He remembered how many times men had asked him about his own scars, and how many times he had met their questions with a wall of silence. Some things weren't owed to anyone. Still, the questions sat heavy in the air. Was she running from someone? Was anyone looking for her? He glanced at the rifle hanging on the wall pegs, and then at the heavy barred door. If there was trouble on her trail, it would find its way here, to his sanctuary, and that meant he had made a choice without knowing all the consequences, a choice that could get them both killed. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked on the porch outside. Asher froze. It wasn't the wind. The wind moaned. This was a sharp, deliberate sound, the sound of weight settling on old wood. Someone was out there. Asher's body went rigid, every instinct from the war screaming back to life. He moved without thinking, silent as a shadow. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the stove, his knuckles white. The rifle was on the wall, too far away, too loud. This had to be quiet. He crept to the door, his bad leg making no sound on the wooden floor. He pressed his ear against the rough planks, listening. Silence. Then another creak, closer this time. Right outside the door. He held his breath. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Na was asleep, vulnerable. He was the only thing standing between her and whatever was lurking in the darkness. He peered through a tiny peephole he'd drilled in the door years ago, a holdover from a paranoia he could never quite shake. At first, all he saw was the deep, endless black of the forest at night. Then, a shape moved. A man. A tall silhouette against the snow, not 10 feet from the cabin. He was just standing there, watching, waiting. Asher's blood ran cold. This wasn't a lost traveler, this was a hunter, and not the animal kind. He watched as the man turned his head, scanning the tree line, and in the faint moonlight, Asher saw the glint of something metal on his belt. A pistol. Who was this man? Was he looking for Na? The figure on the porch took a slow step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. He was coming for the door. Asher tightened his grip on the poker, his muscles coiled, ready to strike. He had one chance to take the man by surprise. But then, something else happened. From deep in the woods, an owl hooted. Once, twice. The man on the porch stopped. He tilted his head, listening. Then he answered, a low, guttural whistle that cut through the night. It was a signal. He wasn't alone. The man stepped back off the porch, melting back into the shadows of the trees. He was gone as quickly as he appeared. Asher stayed frozen by the door for a long time, his mind racing. They weren't just passing through. They were organized. They were communicating. They were searching. And they were close. Dangerously close. He finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, and leaned his forehead against the cold wood of the door. The immediate threat was gone, but the fear lingered, thick and suffocating in the small cabin. He turned and looked at Na, sleeping peacefully in his bed. She had no idea how close death had just come. He looked at her bruised face, at the clean line of stitches on her leg. He had brought her here to save her. But what if all he'd done was trap them both? The pale morning light filtered weak and gray through the cracks in the shutters. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers, but the cabin was still warm. Asher hadn't slept at all. He'd spent the night in the chair by the door, rifle across his lap, listening to the sounds of the forest. He'd heard nothing else. The men, whoever they were, had vanished, but he knew they were still out there, watching. He was stoking the fire when he heard her shift beneath the quilt. Her eyes opened, sluggish at first, blinking against the dim light. Then they sharpened as she remembered where she was. Her hand went to the bandage on her leg. She touched it gently, then looked at him. "You stitched it," she said, her voice still raw. "I did," Asher answered, his voice low. "It'll hold, if you keep it clean." He didn't mention the visitor from the night before. There was no point in scaring her. Not yet. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her breath catching from the effort. He saw the doubt in her eyes. Not about the stitches. About him. She was lying in a stranger's bed, wounded, weak, with no way to defend herself. Asher understood that look. He'd lived with that same kind of weariness for years, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. To ease the tension, he moved to the stove and filled a tin cup with coffee. He set it on the table by her bed. Coffee. Strong. No sugar. It's the best I've got. She stared at the cup for a long moment before she took it. Her fingers trembled, but she lifted it and drank. He saw the hunger in her eyes, a sharp, desperate look that was more powerful than the pain in her leg. "I'll get you something to eat," he said, already turning back to the stove. He scooped a ladle of beans and venison scraps into a bowl, set it down for her with a spoon, and then stepped back, giving her space. She watched him for a beat, measuring him, before she pulled the bowl close and began to eat in small, careful bites. Asher leaned against the far wall, his arms folded, saying nothing. He let her eat, but his mind was on the men in the woods. When the bowl was half empty, he broke the silence. "You from a camp near here?" he asked, his tone casual. Her eyes lifted to his, dark and guarded. Not anymore. That was all she gave him, and he didn't push. He knew what it was like to carry a past you didn't want to share, but he had to know one thing. "Was anyone with you?" Her jaw tightened. "No." She looked down at her food again, her face a blank mask, but the way her hand clenched around the spoon told him everything he needed to know. She was lying. Whatever had happened out there, she hadn't been alone. Not at first. After she finished eating, he took the bowl and rinsed it. Her eyes followed his every move, trying to piece him together. Her gaze lingered on the rifle hanging by the door. She tensed. He noticed it immediately. "It stays there," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't touch it unless there's a need." She gave the faintest nod, but he saw her shoulders relax just a little. She trusted him, at least for now. But what would happen when she learned the truth? That the danger wasn't just outside the cabin, but that it had followed her right to his door? Later that day, he checked her bandage. The wound was clean, the stitches holding. "You'll walk again," he told her, binding the leg back up. "But not yet. You move too soon. It'll tear open." She just watched him, her eyes searching his face. He could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. "Who are you? Why are you helping me?" As the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They were hunting me." Asher stopped what he was doing. He turned to face her. "Who?" "Men," she said, her eyes distant, lost in a memory. "They came to our camp. They were looking for something." "What were they looking for?" Asher pressed, his gut tightening. She shook her head, pulling the quilt tighter around her. "I don't know. But they were angry. They took my father." Her voice broke on the last word. Asher's mind flashed back to the man on the porch, the signal. They weren't just hunting. They were professionals. "What happened to your father?" he asked gently. Her eyes met his, and what he saw in them made his blood run cold. It was a look of pure, undiluted terror. "They're still looking for me," she whispered. "And they won't stop. Not until they find what he gave me." Before Asher could ask what it was, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the evening air. It was the same signal he'd heard last night, but this time it was closer. Much closer. And it was answered by another whistle, from the other side of the cabin. They were surrounded. The whistle echoed, a predator's call bouncing off the frozen trees. Asher didn't hesitate. He moved to the single window, his body low, and peered through a tiny gap in the shutters. He saw them, two figures moving through the dusk at the edge of the clearing. They were carrying rifles. They moved with the practiced ease of soldiers, using the trees for cover, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the last of the fading light. He turned back to Na. Her face was a mask of terror, her eyes wide, fixed on the door. "Get down!" he hissed, his voice a low command. "And stay quiet." He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the heavy rifle from its pegs on the wall. He checked the load, his movements quick and efficient. The feel of the cold steel in his hands was familiar, a grim comfort from a life he thought he had left behind. He blew out the single lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, the only light coming from the faint orange glow of the stove. "Who are they, Na?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "You have to tell me." "His name is Silas," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "He leads them. He's a monster." Asher's blood went cold. Silas. The name hit him like a physical blow, a ghost from his past rising from the grave. He knew that name. He knew the man. And he knew just how much of a monster he could be. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the darkness, startlingly close. "Asher Hale! I know you're in there, you coward!" It was Silas. His voice was just as he remembered it, arrogant, cruel, and dripping with menace. Asher's mind reeled. How did Silas know his name? How did he know he was here? He'd been living in this valley for 3 years, a hermit, a ghost. No one knew he existed, unless they weren't just hunting Na. Maybe they had been hunting him all along. "Come on out, Hale!" Silas shouted again, his voice laced with a sick amusement. "I have a message for you, from an old friend." Asher's grip tightened on his rifle. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a trap. And Na had walked right into the middle of it. He looked over at her, huddled on the floor, her face pale in the firelight. She was staring at him, her eyes filled with a new, terrifying question. Who was he? Who was this man who knew the monster from her nightmares? The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of his own heart. He was trapped. Silas had him pinned down with a wounded woman to protect. He had to make a choice: fight and risk Na getting caught in the crossfire, or surrender and face the man he had run from all those years ago. "Last chance, Hale!" Silas yelled. "Send out the girl and I might just let you live through the night." The offer hung in the air, a poisonous temptation. Give her up. Save himself. It was the coward's way out. It was the choice he had run to these mountains to escape. He looked at Na. Her eyes were pleading with him, not to save her, but to not become the monster they were both hiding from. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He had made a promise. "You're safe here." He raised the rifle to his shoulder, aimed it at the door, and in a voice that was low, steady, and full of a cold, hard certainty, he answered, "Go to hell, Silas!" A single gunshot was the reply. The bullet splintered the thick wood of the door, missing Asher's head by inches. Wood chips exploded into the cabin. Na screamed. "Wrong answer, Hale!" Silas roared from the darkness, followed by the cruel sound of laughter. Another shot rang out, this time shattering the small window pane, sending a spray of glass across the floor. The cold night air rushed in. Asher didn't waste time firing back blindly. That's what Silas wanted, for him to waste his ammunition, reveal his exact position. Silas wasn't a fool. He was a tactician. He would try to draw him out. "He's toying with us," Asher whispered to Na, who was still huddled on the floor. "He wants me to panic." "What are we going to do?" she breathed, her body shaking uncontrollably. Asher's mind was a whirlwind. He was a soldier, a trapper. He knew how to survive. But he was one man, with a bad leg, against at least 3, maybe more, and he had a civilian to protect. The odds were impossible. He scanned the small cabin, his eyes darting from the barred door to the boarded-up back window. There was no escape. They were in a wooden box, a coffin. Silas and his men started firing in a volley, peppering the front of the cabin with lead. The noise was deafening, the bullets thudding into the logs, tearing through the walls like angry hornets. Asher pulled Na further away from the wall, shielding her with his own body. He had to do something Silas wouldn't expect. His eyes fell on the stove. It was packed with wood, glowing red hot. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his mind. "The chimney," he whispered to Na. She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "What?" "The smoke," he said, his mind racing. "If I can create enough smoke, I can blind them. It might give us a chance, a small one." He crawled over to the woodpile, grabbing the driest, most resinous pieces of pine. He shoved them into the stove one after another, cramming it full. Then he took the can of lantern oil. "This is going to get hot," he said, his voice grim. "Stay low to the floor." He opened the stove door and doused the wood with oil. The fire roared to life with a whoosh, a furious orange beast straining against the iron walls of the stove. Thick, black smoke began to pour out of the chimney pipe. Outside, the shooting stopped. "What the hell is he doing in there?" he heard one of Silas's men shout. The smoke was working. It was billowing out of the chimney, thick and acrid, creating a dense smoke screen that was settling over the clearing. "Now," Asher said to himself. It was now or never. He moved to the back of the cabin, to a section of the wall where he knew the logs were weaker. He had a small hand axe by the hearth. He grabbed it. "When I break through, you run," he told Na. "Run for the creek. Don't stop. Don't look back. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and a new, fierce determination. Asher took a deep breath and swung the axe. The wood groaned. He swung again and again. The noise was loud, a clear signal of his intentions, but he didn't have a choice. Finally, with a loud crack, one of the logs gave way. He kicked it out, creating a small, jagged hole leading to the darkness behind the cabin. "Go!" he yelled. "Now!" Na scrambled through the opening, her injured leg slowing her down, but she didn't cry out. She disappeared into the night. Asher turned back, his rifle ready. He heard Silas shouting orders. "He's going out the back! Circle around! Don't let them get to the trees!" Footsteps crunched in the snow, coming from both sides of the cabin. They were closing in. Asher fired 2 quick shots toward the front of the cabin, a desperate diversion. Then he squeezed through the hole himself, the rough wood tearing at his coat. He landed in the snow, his bad leg screaming in protest. He could see Na ahead of him, a fleeing shadow making for the dark line of the trees. She was limping badly. She wouldn't make it. He had to buy her more time. He saw one of Silas's men coming around the corner of the cabin. The man raised his rifle. Asher fired first. The shot was true. The man crumpled to the ground, one down. But now they knew exactly where he was. A bullet whizzed past his ear. Another kicked up snow at his feet. He was exposed, a perfect target. He scrambled for cover behind a large pine tree, his heart pounding, his lungs burning. He reloaded his rifle, his fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. He could hear Na crashing through the undergrowth ahead of him. She was getting further away. Good. "You can't run forever, Hale." Silas's voice echoed through the trees, closer now. "You should have stayed buried." Asher peeked around the tree. He saw a muzzle flash from the direction of the creek. They were trying to cut her off. He had to draw their fire. He had to make himself the target. He stepped out from behind the tree, raised his rifle, and fired at the second muzzle flash. He didn't know if he hit anything, but it didn't matter, because a searing, white-hot pain exploded in his shoulder. He staggered back, the rifle falling from his numb fingers. He clutched at his shoulder, his hand coming away slick and dark with blood. He'd been hit. He collapsed into the snow, his vision swimming, the sounds of the forest fading into a dull roar. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Na, stopping at the edge of the trees, turning back, her face a perfect portrait of horror. She was looking right at him, and behind her, another shadow was rising. Silas. He had her. The darkness that swallowed Asher was thick and heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with ghosts, the faces of men he'd served with, the sound of cannon fire, the smell of blood and mud. He was back in the war, the place he'd run from, the place that had never really let him go. He was drowning in it when a new sensation cut through the nightmare, a sharp, stinging pain in his shoulder. Not the dull ache of the old wound, but the fresh, fiery agony of the new one. And then, a voice, soft, urgent. "Asher, wake up, please." His eyes fluttered open. The world swam into focus. He wasn't in a muddy trench. He was lying on a bed of pine needles, the branches of a dense fir tree forming a makeshift roof over his head. And Na was leaning over him. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes were clear and focused. In her hand, she held a piece of her own torn dress, pressing it hard against his bleeding shoulder. "You came back," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "You told me to run," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't tell me to leave you to die." He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. He fell back, groaning. "Silas," he managed to say. "Where is he?" "Gone," she said. "For now. They think you're dead, or dying. They took their man, and they left." Asher looked at her, truly looked at her. She wasn't the broken, helpless woman he'd found in the trap. There was a strength in her now, a fire in her eyes he hadn't seen before. "How did you—" he began, but he couldn't finish the question. "I made a noise," she said simply. "Up the ridge. I made them think we were running that way. They followed the sound." She looked down at his shoulder. "We have to stop the bleeding." She had dragged him. He looked around. They were in a small, hidden hollow, a place he'd never seen before. She must have dragged him through the snow all on her own, with her bad leg. The thought staggered him. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You didn't leave me in the trap," she countered, her gaze unwavering. We are the same, you and I. We don't leave people behind. For the first time, he saw the truth of it. They were both survivors, both running from a past that refused to stay buried. She worked on his shoulder with a fierce concentration. She had found a stream nearby and had washed the wound as best she could. Now she was binding it tightly with strips of cloth torn from her dress. Her hands were steady. "You know him," she said, her voice low. It wasn't a question. Asher closed his eyes. There was no point in lying anymore. The secrets had almost gotten them both killed. "Yes," he said, the admission heavy with years of guilt. "His name is Silas Croft. He was my captain. In the war." Na paused, her hand still on the bandage. She waited for him to continue. He was not a good man," Asher said, the understatement hanging in the cold air. "He enjoyed the killing. Too much. He did things I couldn't be a part of." He took a ragged breath, the memory still raw, still burning. There was a village, not a camp of warriors, a village. Old men, women, children. Silas said they were hiding enemy supplies. He ordered us to burn it, to leave no one alive. He could still hear the screams. He could still smell the smoke. "I refused," he whispered. "I told my men to stand down. Silas drew his pistol on me. I shot him, in the arm, then I ran. I've been running ever since. I thought he was dead. I heard he'd been killed in the final days of the war." "He is not a man who dies easy," Na said, her voice dark. "No," Asher agreed. "He's not." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "But what does he want with you? Why was he at your camp?" Na looked away, toward the dark woods. The fear was back in her eyes. He was looking for a map. "A map to what?" "My grandfather was a great shaman," she began, her voice barely audible. "He believed the mountains had a spirit, a heart, and that heart was made of silver." Asher stared at her. "A silver mine?" "Years ago, a prospector stumbled into our territory, near death. My father saved his life. In return, the man gave him a gift. A map to a place the white men had been seeking for generations. A vein of pure silver, hidden deep in the mountains." Now it all made sense. The ruthlessness, the determination. Silas wasn't after revenge. He was after a fortune. "Silas heard the stories," Na continued. "He came to our camp. He tortured my father, trying to make him give up the map. But my father, he was strong. He never spoke a word." Her voice cracked. "Before he died, he gave the map to me. He told me to run, to take it to a safe place." "Where is it now?" Asher asked, his heart sinking. "The map?" Na's hand went to a small leather pouch that was tied around her neck. A pouch he had noticed before, but had never asked about. She had kept it hidden beneath her dress. She pulled it out. It was old and worn. She opened it and took out a small, folded piece of buckskin. She handed it to him. Asher's hands trembled as he unfolded it. It was a crude map, drawn with charcoal, but the landmarks were clear. He recognized the Twin Peaks, the winding river. He knew this land. But as he looked closer, his blood turned to ice. In the bottom corner of the map, there was a small, faded symbol. A mark he recognized. A mark he had worn on his own uniform. It was the insignia of his old army unit. The prospector who drew this map. He hadn't just been a prospector. He had been a soldier, one of Silas's men. This wasn't a coincidence. This whole thing, from the very beginning, was a setup. Silas hadn't just been hunting Na. He had been using her to flush out the one man who knew this territory better than anyone. The one man who could read this map and lead him straight to the silver. Him. The realization hit Asher with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't a protector. He was a pawn. And he had led the wolf right to the lamb. "He herded you," Asher said. his voice a hoarse whisper. "The trap you were found in, it wasn't one of mine, it was one of his. He was pushing you south, into this valley, into his territory." Na stared at him, her eyes wide with dawning horror as she understood. "He knew you were here." "He knew I would find you," Asher said, his voice filled with self-loathing. "He knows how I think. He knew I wouldn't leave you out there." He had played right into Silas's hands. Every choice he had made, thinking he was being a good man, had been part of a cold, calculated plan. They were silent for a long moment, the terrible truth settling between them. They weren't just two survivors hiding from a monster. They were two pieces in a game they didn't even know they were playing. "We can't stay here," Asher said finally, pushing himself up, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. "He'll be back. He knows this is a dead end. He knows we have nowhere else to go." "Where can we go?" Na asked, her voice laced with despair. Asher looked at the map in his hand. The landmarks, the peaks, the river. He had two choices: run and let Silas hunt them down like animals. Or he could change the game. "We don't run," he said, a new cold resolve hardening his voice. "We stop being the hunted. We become the hunters." He pointed to a spot on the map, a narrow canyon, a place of sharp rocks and treacherous drops, a place called Devil's Jaw. "He wants the silver," Asher said, his eyes meeting Na's. "We're going to give it to him." For the next 2 days, they were ghosts. They moved through the dense forest, leaving as little trace as possible. Asher's shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent fire, but he ignored it. The pain was a focus, a reminder of what was at stake. Na was transformed. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a quiet, fierce resolve. She knew this land in a way Asher never could. She showed him how to walk on rocks to avoid leaving footprints, how to find edible roots beneath the frozen ground, how to read the language of the birds to know when someone was near. They became a team, their skills complementing each other perfectly. His soldier's instinct for tactics and her deep ancestral knowledge of the wilderness. During the cold nights, huddled together for warmth under a rocky overhang, they talked. The walls between them crumbled, washed away by the shared danger. He told her about his brother, about the guilt he still carried for not being there when the fever took him. She told him about her father, about his strength and his kindness, and the stories he would tell her by the fire. They were no longer just Asher and Na. They were two halves of a single, desperate hope. "Silas will expect us to head for the mountains," Asher said, studying the map by the light of a small, smokeless fire. "He'll think we're going for the mine." "We are not?" Na asked. "No," Asher said, a grim smile touching his lips. "We're going to let him think we are. We're going to lead him on a chase, wear him down, separate him from his men." The plan was simple and deadly. They would leave a trail, an obvious one, heading straight for Devil's Jaw. But it would be a trail filled with traps, not the steel-jawed kind that catch the leg, but the kind that catch the mind. False turns, dead ends, small, frustrating delays designed to make Silas impatient, reckless. They started the next morning. They laid a clear path through a muddy creek bed, then doubled back on the rocky ground, heading in the opposite direction. They built a small, temporary shelter and left the remains of a fire, as if they had camped there, then pushed on. Every step was a calculation. Every choice was a weapon. 2 days later, their first trap paid off. They had climbed to a high ridge that overlooked the valley. From their hiding place, they watched as Silas and his 2 remaining men followed their false trail. They saw the frustration in Silas's posture, the angry way he gestured to his men. He was falling for it. "Now," Na whispered. She had spent the morning gathering a large pile of loose rocks and balancing them precariously on the edge of a steep incline, right above the trail Silas was on. With a single, well-aimed push from a long pole, She sent the rocks tumbling down. It wasn't a huge landslide, not enough to kill them, but it was enough. The rocks crashed down onto the trail, blocking their path, forcing them to backtrack and find another way around. It was a delay, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And more importantly, it separated them. In the chaos, one of Silas's men had scrambled up the slope to the east, while Silas and the other went west. They were divided. "One down," Asher whispered, his eyes glinting with a cold fire. "Let's go get him." They tracked the lone man for hours, moving silently through the trees, always staying downwind. They found him making camp for the night by a small stream. He was careless, confident, thinking he was the hunter. He never even saw them coming. Asher came up behind him, a rock in his hand. It was over in seconds, quiet, brutal, necessary. They took the man's rifle, his ammunition, and a small bag of dried jerky. They left his body by the stream, a message for Silas. The game had changed. They doubled back, circling around to get ahead of Silas again. But as they were moving through a thick patch of woods, Asher's foot caught on a root. He stumbled, his bad leg giving way. He fell hard, a sharp cry of pain escaping his lips. He looked down. The old scar on his thigh, the one from the war, had torn open. Blood was already soaking through his trousers. The wound he'd always feared reopening had finally betrayed him. He was crippled. Out here, in the middle of a hunt, a wound like that was a death sentence. Na was at his side in an instant, her face etched with worry. She helped him to a sheltered spot behind a cluster of boulders. "We have to stop," she said, her voice firm. "You can't go on like this." "We don't have a choice," Asher gritted out through clenched teeth, the pain a white-hot agony. "Silas will find us. He'll see the blood." "Then we will make our stand here," Na said, her eyes scanning their surroundings. The place was a natural fortress, a jumble of massive boulders that created a series of small, defensible positions. It wasn't perfect, but it was their only chance. Na worked quickly, using the skills he had taught her, combined with her own. She helped him into the most protected spot, a narrow crevice between two giant rocks. She tended to his leg, binding it as tightly as she could. Then she took the second rifle. "You taught me how to shoot," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear he knew she must be feeling. "Now I will hunt." She looked at him, her dark eyes holding his. "You fought for me. Now I will fight for you." She disappeared into the rocks, moving with a silent grace that made her one with the wilderness. Asher was alone, wounded, barely able to move. All he could do was wait and listen. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the landscape. The forest grew quiet, too quiet. Then he heard it, a twig snapping, the sound of boots on gravel. They were here. He raised his rifle, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the blood loss. He peered through a crack in the rocks. He saw them, Silas and his last man, moving cautiously through the trees, their rifles at the ready. They were walking right into the trap. Asher's heart pounded. Where was Na? Suddenly a shot rang out, not from his position, but from high above them, from the top of the boulders. Silas's man cried out and fell, clutching his leg. He was wounded, not dead. Na was a good shot, but she wasn't a killer. Not yet. Silas reacted instantly, diving for cover behind a tree, firing blindly up at the rocks. "Show yourself, you witch!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. Asher knew this was his chance. While Silas was distracted, focused on Na, he had a clear shot. He lined up the sights, centering them on Silas's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. This was it. The end of the nightmare. The ghost that had haunted him for years. But then he hesitated. Killing a man in the heat of battle was one thing. But this felt different. It felt like an execution. Was this who he was now? Was this the only way to be free? In that moment of hesitation, Silas moved. He scrambled away from the tree, keeping low, and disappeared behind another cluster of rocks. The chance was gone. Asher cursed himself. His weakness had put them both in even more danger. He could hear Silas shouting, trying to pinpoint Na's location, and he could hear Na moving through the rocks above, a phantom always one step ahead. The sun had set. Darkness was falling fast. The final battle would be fought in the shadows. Asher knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay here, a liability. He had to draw Silas out. To him. He took a deep breath, ignoring the fire in his leg and his shoulder. He pulled himself out of the crevice and began to drag himself across the open ground toward the center of the boulder field. He was making himself bait. It didn't take long. "Well, well," Silas's voice sneered from the darkness. "Look what crawled out from under a rock." Asher saw him, a dark shape detaching itself from the shadows. He was 20 feet away, close enough. "It's over, Hale," Silas said, raising his rifle. "Your little Apache girl can't save you now." "It was never about the silver, was it, Silas?" Asher said, his voice surprisingly strong. "It was about this, about finishing what we started." Silas laughed, a cold, empty sound. "The silver will be a nice bonus, but you were a loose end, a deserter, a coward who couldn't follow orders." "I couldn't murder children," Asher corrected him. "They were the enemy," Silas roared. "There is no innocence in war." "That's where you're wrong," Asher said quietly. And then he saw it, a flicker of movement on the rocks behind Silas. It was Na. She was perched on a high ledge, the rifle in her hands. But she wasn't aiming at Silas. She was aiming at a huge, precariously balanced boulder just above him, the same trick she'd used before. Their eyes met in the gloom. A silent understanding passed between them. Asher had to keep him talking. "You're a butcher, Silas," Asher spat. "And a thief. You sent that man to get the map, didn't you? One of your own men. Then you killed him to keep it for yourself." Silas's face contorted with rage. "He was weak, just like you." He took a step forward, raising his rifle for the final shot. "It ends now, Hale." "Yes," Asher said. "It does." A single shot cracked through the night. It wasn't from Silas's rifle. It was from Na's. The bullet struck the rock face just behind the massive boulder. The impact, combined with its precarious balance, was enough. With a deep, grinding groan, the boulder began to shift. Silas looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. He had no time to run, no time to even scream. The boulder crashed down with the force of an avalanche, a ton of granite and earth that crushed the spot where Silas had been standing. And then, silence. A profound, echoing silence that settled over the valley. The dust cleared. There was nothing left. No sign that Silas Croft had ever existed. He had been erased from the earth. It was over. The silence held. Asher lay in the dirt, his body screaming in pain, but his mind was quiet for the first time in years. The ghosts were gone. He saw Na climbing down from the rocks, her rifle held loosely in her hand. She rushed to his side, her face pale in the moonlight. She knelt beside him, her hand gently touching his cheek. Is it done?" she whispered. Asher reached up, his hand covering hers. He looked into her eyes, and he saw his own relief reflected there. "It's done," he said. "We're safe." They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors huddled together in the darkness, the weight of the world finally lifted from their shoulders. The journey back was slow, a painful crawl from the edge of death back to the promise of life. Na became his strength, her small frame supporting his broken one. They leaned on each other, two wounded souls finding their way home. When they finally saw the cabin, it looked different. It was no longer a place to hide from the world. It was a sanctuary they had fought for, a home they had earned. Inside, the fire was long dead, the air cold and stale. But as Na lit a lantern, the small room filled with a warm, gentle light. It felt like a new beginning. For weeks, they healed. Na tended to his wounds with a gentle, practiced hand, and he watched as the last of the fear faded from her eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet strength. The silence between them was no longer filled with suspicion or unspoken questions. It was filled with a comfortable, easy peace. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Asher held the worn buckskin map in his hands, the key to a fortune, the cause of so much pain and death. Na looked at it, then at him. "What will you do with it?" she asked. Asher looked at the flames, then back at the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. He thought about the silver, about the wealth it could bring, and then he thought about the cost. He slowly reached out and dropped the map into the fire. They watched together as the edges curled, turned black, and vanished into ash. The silver, and the curse it carried, was gone forever. "Our life," Asher said, his voice thick with emotion, "is worth more than any silver." Na reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." The thaw came, and with it, the valley awoke. The creek ran high and clear, and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the damp earth. Asher's leg healed, leaving him with a deeper limp but a lighter heart. Na's own limp was almost gone, a faint reminder of the trap that had brought them together. They planted a garden. They repaired the roof. They fell into a simple, beautiful rhythm. They didn't need many words. They understood each other in the quiet spaces, in the shared glances, in the comfortable silence of two people who had found their place in the world. One day, they rode into town. Not as a man and the woman he was hiding, but as two people building a life. The stares were still there, the whispers still followed them, but they didn't matter anymore. They walked to the justice's office hand in hand. Their vows were simple, spoken in the quiet room, with the town's storekeeper as their only witness. But those simple words carried the weight of everything they had survived. They were a promise, a testament. Standing on the porch afterward, the spring sun warm on their faces, Na looked up at him, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "Asher Hale," she said, testing the sound of her new name. He looked down at his wife, at the woman who had walked out of a nightmare and into his life, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was finally home. The war was over. The hunt was done. What lay ahead was a new story, one they would write together, line by line, day by day, in the quiet peace of their valley. If you enjoyed this story and believe that everyone deserves a second chance at peace, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out, and you won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up next. Thanks for watching.